Okay, well, I think we can get started. So, hi everyone. What is today? Happy Wednesday. Happy morning. And welcome to today's session on Strategic Learning 101. We're so thrilled that you could all join us. Before we get too far into things, I'd like to start us off with a bit of a land acknowledgement. So I want to recognize that we're hosting this event on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional gathering place, traveling route to the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, and Nakota Sioux. We also acknowledge all of the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit whose footsteps have marked these lands for millennia. And for those of you who might be joining us from a different territory, from somewhere else, feel free to throw in the comments where it is you're coming from today. So as organizations, ECVO and the University of Alberta's Evaluation Capacity Network are grateful to have a public platform through which we can continue to promote learning, collaboration, and the exchange of information for hopefully the betterment of our communities here on Treaty 6. This land acknowledgement, I do want to say, is only a small part of the learning journey towards reconciliation that we're all on. So it's an important one, but a small one. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Emma Wallace, and I'm the program specialist at ECVO. And so a big part of my role is to support capacity building among nonprofits like yourselves. Sorry, I'm casually keep admitting people as I talk, which is why you've got the weird pauses happening. But with me today, I also want to introduce Peter Devos.
Hi, everybody. Nice to see. I see some familiar faces here, so it's exciting to. It's a bit like a reunion, it seems like.
Awesome. And Peter is joining us from the University of Alberta, the Evaluation Capacity Network. So this webinar is hosted in partnership with ECVO and the Evaluation Capacity Network, with the purpose of increasing evaluation and strategic learning capacity across the sector. And then before we get too far into things, I have a couple housekeeping pieces. So we are recording today's session. I've got the recording view on speaker view only, but if you're not comfortable with the idea of being recorded, feel free to turn off your camera for parts of it. And then, yeah, today's webinar is a 1.5 hour introduction to strategic learning. If you have any questions at any point, you're welcome to throw them in the chat. We'll be monitoring the chat box, and we'll either kind of pop in to answer those questions throughout the session or at the end. And then lastly, this will be a bit of an interactive session. So we encourage you to kind of reflect on the content as it's happening and engage when encouraged. So I think with that in mind, I'm excited to introduce our presenter today. We have Sami Berger to lead us through our strategic learning lesson.
Hi, everyone. It's so nice to, see some of you and have you all here. For the past 8 years, I've been working with organizations and initiatives that are thinking critically about their strategies. I'm an evaluator, so I'm really passionate about supporting learning that actually helps us question our assumptions and guide how we think, care, and act in the world and not just sit in reports. So I look forward to sharing some thoughts on Strategic Learning 101 with you today. And as Emma said, hearing from you all in the interactive portions of the session. And I'm going to be stubborn and wait for you to respond when I ask. So please do. On this welcome screen, as you can see, we already did introductions. We're going to spend some time defining strategic learning. I think that's really important. We're going to go through some practical requirements that need to be in place to effectively learn strategically. And finally, hopefully by the end of this, you'll have a clear understanding of what the opportunity is for strategic learning and feel really excited about either starting on a journey of strategic learning or continuing along that path, which is what I suspect, I'm sure many of you are already on a path of strategic learning for yourselves and your organizations. So as I said, I wanted to start off by taking some time to define what we mean by strategic learning. And of course, there are two words in strategic learning that we need to define. And the first is strategic or strategy. So we'll start there. Now, before I go any further, this is what we warned you about. We're going to ask you to take 2 minutes and have you write in the chat what comes to mind for you when you think of strategy. Thanks, Cheryl. Our desired goal, Liz says long-term thinking, making decisions with foresight, way to do things, a process, roadmap, plan to get to a goal, plan. Something with intention, outcomes in mind, planning, plan with goals, long-term plan, plans progress and grow, roadmap, perhaps another way to say an intentional plan. High-level plans. See a lot about plans. That's great. And one thing to keep in mind during this presentation might be what the difference is between like an action plan or a non-strategic plan and a strategic plan, given that that's something that's coming up a lot. Having evaluated risks and opportunities, critically assessing the landscape, which is similar to evaluating risks and opportunities, so seeing outside of ourselves. And I see a lot of like the comments around planning, having it be long-term, being intentional, connected to our goals. This is all great. And also a little different from one another. So it might be helpful to take this time to get on the same page about what we mean by strategy, but these are all certainly elements of strategy that we're going to be touching back on. So the first thing to think about with strategy is that you only need strategy when you're in a context with people or circumstances that are helping or hindering the change you're trying to make. So for example, if you think of baking a cake, you don't need a strategy to bake a cake unless you have other bakers around you that are trying to stop your baking efforts or poisoning your ingredients or messing with your oven. And I think the historical root of the word strategy is really interesting in thinking about this idea of having supporters or detractors in the context of strategy. And I love looking at the historical roots of words to help gesture towards parts of its meaning that we might not have thought of otherwise. So the historical root of strategy is that it comes from the ancient Greek word, which I'll mispronounce, strategos, to think like a general. And in ancient Greece, military leaders were often also territorial governors. So they were politicians as well as generals. So like in war or in politics, you'll always have passive or active adversaries or passive and active supporters. And those are the situations where you need strategy. And this isn't necessarily about someone or something malicious that's trying to stop you from achieving your end goals, although it might be. But there are so many things around us that get in the way of us making the change we're trying to make. So ideally, your strategy acknowledges that you aren't the only one trying to make change and that there will be forces that will either support or oppose your efforts. Related to this, our definition of strategy has to acknowledge that strategizing can't happen in a bubble. And some of you pointed to that in what you wrote in the chat in terms of evaluating risks and opportunities and critically assessing our current landscape. That's certainly an important part of strategy. Your strategy will unfortunately be inherently flawed and limiting if you're only paying attention to dynamics within your organization. You're always going to have to pay attention to forces outside of your organization, and there are many ways to do this. I'm sure some of you have engaged in activities like systems mapping, But there's also informal approaches like intentionally speaking to important stakeholders to understand how the broader circumstances that you're located within might be helping or getting in the way of your strategic goals or your mission. And this also ties to what some of you said in the chat about linking strategy to your goals or your long-term plans. That's very important. Because you're paying attention to the outside world, this means that strategy is always dynamic and changing by definition. So even if your organization remained completely stable, which of course is not a reality, as I'm sure you can all attest, the outside world is always changing. And so strategy always requires you to pay attention to changes in your context and to think through how they impact what kinds of strategic opportunities and challenges are coming up that are relevant to you. And these changes might be really broad, such as shifts in government or policy or funding availability, which I'm sure are all things you regularly pay attention to. But they could also be even broader, like considering the effects of climate change on your strategy. So for example, increased flooding and fires and storms might impact how an organization that serves the unhoused population has to think about their strategy. And it's not only these really big picture issues, it might be something more immediate in your context that's important to pay attention to. So for example, if another organization in your city has started offering a complementary program, it might be strategic for you all to coordinate referrals. So it's paying attention to the outside world at all of these levels, which I'm sure sounds incredibly overwhelming, but there are ways to do it in systematically as well. The third part of our definition of strategy is that you only need strategy when you're trying to create or resist some sort of change. Another way of phrasing this is to think of strategy as being about power, which is all about the ability to create or withstand change, which is something you're all trying to do through your organizations. So you all need strategy. Creating change also means that your strategy is future focused. You're doing your best to predict and anticipate what actions to take to create the change articulated in your mission or your strategy. And so the things you're taking into consideration when you make these predictions about the future are essential to the quality of your strategy. You can make very accurate predictions because of the quality of your information, or you can make very poor predictions because of the lack of quality of your information, or perhaps something completely unexpected happens. But it's all about that process of trying to predict and adjusting as you go. It's also helpful when you're thinking about creating strategic change to think about strategy as a story rather than as a stagnant plan. And a lot of you use the word plan in the definition, or like words that come to mind when you think about strategy. And there can be dynamic plans, there could be stagnant plans, but it's, I think, intentionally thinking about dynamic plans or plans that are very aligned with how we tell stories and think about stories can be helpful to stop us from falling into the trap of creating a really linear plan and never revising us, which is unfortunately something that happens. So when a plan is strategic, this is what I mean when I say think of it like a story. When a plan's strategic, it's more likely to articulate not only what you're doing as an organization, but it's a rich story. It also tells you why you're doing it, how it relates to the forces outside of your organization that will impact your ability to create change, etc. There's some detail there, especially around the how and why. And like any story, a strategy should provide you with a strong narrative of the change you're creating, how you're creating it, and why you've chosen that course of action. And that can come in any format. So for example, a theory of change is one type of story that you might tell about your strategy. Of course, though, I think the biggest challenge with the story metaphor is that it isn't a piece of fiction. And so it's really important that your story has a factual basis, which then becomes the foundation for all of the learning and reflection and adaptation that you do as an organization. So it's also not a story that stays the same throughout time. It changes throughout time as you're testing and learning and adapting. So in summary, we need strategy when there's a desire to create change, when there are active forces working against or working with what you're trying to achieve, when there's change and uncertainty in your context, and when there's no clear answer to getting where you need to be. And of course, even if you're doing, like, all of these things are really hard to do with 100% perfection. There are limitations to any strategy. We live in unpredictable environments and always have limited influence. And that's why strategic learning is really, and it sounds cliche in a lot of ways, and I think we say these things and sort of nod, but I think that, like, taking a moment to really absorb the fact that strategic learning is a continuous, ongoing process takes us, and like thinking about what that actually looks like and what that would mean for us would really advance how we think about strategic learning in significant ways. Yeah, it's continuous and ongoing process. So after all of that, we might have a working definition that you might want to consider for strategy, which we're proposing as strategy being the integrated set of choices that position an organization for success within a dynamic environment. And I'll pause there for a second for you to feel that in your soul. And I will also pause to have you mull over a little bit, like, what this means to you and how you've articulated your strategy to date. We won't have to, like, I'm sure you're not here with your whole teams, and we only have time for a couple of small group conversations today. So these are questions I encourage you to write down and think about after the session with other members of your team. But think about what parts of context does your current strategy consider? Does it take into consideration the other organizations or policies or circumstances that might be actively helping or getting in the way of what you're trying to achieve? Is your strategy about the change you're trying to make as an organization, rather than a program plan or summary of activities, which sometimes those things get muddled a little bit? And I'm also curious, like, for you to reflect what this definition of strategy has brought up to you, for you. Maybe it feels like very familiar and something you've thought about a lot, or maybe there are elements of it that feel different or have prompted some questions. And I see that there haven't been any questions shared in the chat, but if we're gonna move on from defining strategy after this pause. So if you have any questions about the definition or what I just shared, and yes, I could go back to the definition, please feel free to pop that in the chat. Okay, I will move on to our second important word. And of course, if anything comes up about strategy in the meantime, feel free to put it in the chat at any point, because we're going to be talking about strategy this whole time. So the next part of strategic learning is that we need to define is learning. So just like before, let's take 2 minutes and have you write in the chat what comes to mind for you when you think of learning. I find these questions really hard because they're words we use all the time. We don't always reflect on what they mean to us. So I'm curious to see what comes up.
Sami, is it okay if I just add one thing about choice making?
Of course.
Just that I found interesting that triggered for me.
Yes.
If strategy is about a set of choices, those choices include not only what you're going to do, but what you've chosen not to do. So the decisions, the choices we do, sometimes the most critical choices we make are the choices not to do something, which also impacts strategy.
Oh my
So I
gosh,
just thought,
Peter, that's so right. And I think that's the thing that we find the hardest, you know, that phrase, kill your darlings, which is it's pretty morbid, right? But I think it's because it recognizes how hard it is to choose not to do things often based on like our constraints with our capacities and resources. So it's all about that match between what capacity and resources we have, what the outside world is requiring of us, and how we're matching that up. And it's always constrained. And so, Peter, to your point, choosing what not to do is probably more of the choice, like most of the choices that we have to make rather than what to do. Yeah, thanks. Okay, we have a lot about learning. I see stuff about taking in information and internalizing it and gaining knowledge, processing knowledge. I also see some stuff around understanding. I see a lot about growth, changing perspectives. That's always hard to do. We're going to talk a little bit about that. How we gain understanding. Yeah, so I see here, actually, it's very similar to the definition I'm going to share, a lot about gaining knowledge and internalizing it. And I will add in this definition, applying it. So simply put, learning is the process of acquiring, which a lot of you touched on, but also applying knowledge. Of course, we aren't the only species that learns. Ringtail lemurs learn about food preferences from adults in their group, and cockatoos learn foraging behavior. But this definition points us to a really important question. Where are we acquiring knowledge from, and does it matter? I'd say yes, it matters. It's sort of a leading question, I would say. So really broadly as human beings, we draw on a lot of different sources of learning all of the time, and the quality of these sources of learning vary immensely. So for example, evolutionary psychologists tell us that because of our genetic programming, we tend to avoid loss and fear new things. Our individual experience of burning ourselves on a stove might tell us not to put our hand there in the future, which is obviously helpful. But we also may have been bitten by a dog once, which leads to a phobia of all dogs, which can be less helpful because most dogs are great. Cultural resources like books and films could teach us about history, but obviously those types of resources can be both high quality and give us like an accurate snapshot of a piece of history, and they can be really low quality or biased, or tell a very constrained story. We could also learn through the scientific method, so that's how we build bridges and make vaccines, which is great. So all of this to say, there are many ways that we are learning about things. And these sources of knowledge are always in play and always exist and always impact us. And in the context of our organizations, we're still human beings. So as organizations made up as human beings, we still fear new things. We might learn about our context from someone we trust for good or bad, or helpful or unhelpful reasons. Let's not say good or bad. We might think about opportunities within our organization, but based on what's been successful in the past, or draw on our own past experience or our personal or work lives. We might be drawing on cultural resources like best practices that have been published from other groups or organizations that are similar to us. And we may have also systematically collected data. All of these are possible sources of strategic learning. An evaluation exists as one way, just one way, of systematically collecting, analyzing, and interpreting data from all of these sources to inform our judgments about what we should do strategically. And when it's done well, and it could certainly be done poorly, but when it's done well, evaluation has the benefit of being a little more, well, a lot more, it's a discipline. So it's more systematic and therefore more reliable and oftentimes more valid and more neutral than any one person's judgment. because it's collecting judgments from many people and putting it together to make an assessment. So that's our definition of learning. We're sticking with this one. Learning is the process of acquiring and applying knowledge, hopefully with a little bit more food for thought about what it means to where we're acquiring knowledge from. And I'm going to get into a little bit more about applying knowledge in the next section. But like before, I just want to pause and have you think about how your organization approaches learning to date. So how do you acquire knowledge? Is it systematic and formal, or more informal? Maybe both. How do you apply knowledge that you gather to your strategic decision making? So actually applying that knowledge in the context of what you choose to do. And what are some of the opportunities and challenges that you've noticed in trying to apply that learning? Because it's not an easy process. So I'm going to pause here. If anyone has reflections they want to share in the chat, or any questions to share in the chat, please do. And Peter, if you have any more thoughts about learning, not to put you on the spot.
No, I think I'm really enjoying the way you're framing it.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay, so now that we've defined strategy and learning, knowledge can be acquired both formal and informal, in both informal and formal ways. Yes, absolutely. And like these sources of learning, none of them are better or worse. It's about matching our needs to, like, if we were building a bridge based on just our gut feelings and individual experience, that wouldn't result in a very sturdy bridge unless we have really deep experience as, like, you know, a long-time engineer. Although I don't think they could do it without more rigorous tools either. So all of these are in play. There's different levels of formality and informality. It's just being aware of these different sources of learning and how we're using them and in what context. So we have defined strategy and learning. So we can finally define strategic learning. So based on everything we've said so far, we can say that strategic learning is systematically acquiring and applying knowledge to inform adaptation and change. And in an organizational context, we can say that it is systematically acquiring and applying knowledge to inform adaptation and change in our organization's strategies. And this quote from Churchill on the left here just makes me laugh. So I'm going to share it with you. It reads, "How beautiful the strategy. You should occasionally look at the results." It's very cheeky, but I think it's funny and reflects something about the human condition. I think we like making strategies, but then don't always take the next step. I've seen, and I'm sure you all have seen, many beautiful looking, elegant strategic plans that present a completely convincing and sometimes even evidence-based narrative of how an organization or an initiative is going to move towards its goals. And for better or worse, having that articulated is really only a first, very necessary, but insufficient step in strategic learning. You then have to take that beautiful story or strategic plan and actually systematically acquire knowledge to learn about whether what you've articulated is actually what's playing out. And you have to work towards applying what you've learned to adapt that strategy over time. Of course, acquiring and applying knowledge are two very separate things, and those endeavors have their own challenges associated with them, but both are absolutely essential for strategic learning. One of the reasons strategic learning can be challenging is that in some ways, it's really different from other ways that we learn within organizations. And again, just to say, like, those other ways of learning aren't bad, but when we're talking about strategic learning, there are some requirements. So when we apply a strategic learning approach, we avoid the common trap of planning and implementing something without actually assessing learning and adapting in response to what we learn. It's also really common to have a strategy or a plan, and then we use evaluation to assess whether we had the impact that we wanted or completed the activities listed in that plan. But in strategic learning, it's actually the other way around, or it's more cyclical than that. So you're using learning as a tool to build your strategy in an ongoing way. And there are a few practical requirements that are basic necessities to be able to do strategic learning. And I'm going to share some of those with you in a few moments. But before we move on to the practical requirements, I know I've been talking a lot, and I want to give you some time to digest everything I just shared. So we're going to send you into small groups for about 10 minutes, and we want to give you some time to discuss these two questions. So here's our definition of strategic learning, which is systematically acquiring and applying knowledge to inform adaptation and change in our organization strategies. And I just want to give you a chance to say out loud what stood out to you about how we have defined strategic learning and what opportunities excite you about taking a strategic learning approach. So Emma, if you could send folks into small groups, that would be great. And we'll see you soon.
Okay, give me just 2 seconds here.
We will also put these questions in the chat and broadcast it to you all, so you have it with you, them with you in the room. It's too much to ask to remember all of this.
Sorry, I'm just. Okay, I'm going to open up the rooms now, and we'll broadcast out the questions. See you all in a bit.
Sorry, I'm just going to jump in there quickly, Cheryl. Part of the Eval lab that we're going to run is about, which is a complement to this session, is really using facilitated methods to explore how do we actually build these learning cultures internally. A lot of this is, I think, is about habit formation and creating new processes for reflection built into the life of an organization. And so part of the spirit of Eval lab is to help support that integration. So it's not an activity that sits over here that you only do once a year. It's part of the lifeblood of your organization, and the how do you build natural touch points for reflection, sense making, and then applying the learning.
Yeah. And it's such a funny, tough balance in a lot of ways, because I think it's just so easy to throw out words like, well, you need a culture of learning. And then it's like, well, what does that actually look like? What does that actually mean? And then you get into the nitty gritty, but you can't get lost in the nitty gritty. You have to like constantly go back to like, well, why are we doing this? Because if you end up putting an agenda item at the beginning of each meeting for reflection, but then it becomes rote and no one's thinking critically about it or understanding why they're doing it, and they don't know what to bring up, like then the spirit of it or the purpose of it gets lost, and then it loses its strategic significance. So it's always that like back and forth between, let's figure out how to implement this stuff, and there are ways to do it while maintaining the bigger picture. So yeah, anyway, interesting stuff. Does anyone,
Again.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. Does anyone, before we move into practical requirements for strategic learning, which like is completely connected to what we were just saying, does anyone want to share anything in the chat or out loud about the small group conversation they had, they feel like is stood out? That's okay. Okay, let's move into practical requirements. The first is to make your strategy visible. So in order to learn about and improve your strategy, you actually have
Sorry,
to make.
Sammy, I'm just
might
gonna,
need to
do
share.
you want to shared your slides again?
Oops, sorry.
No.
You need to make your PowerPoint visible as
Yes,
in
there
addition
you
to
go.
making. There you go.
Yeah,
Thank you.
right. PowerPoint has to be visible as is a strategy for similar reasons, right? We want to be talking about and referring to the same things because it could be so easy to be on different pages and not realize. So there are many ways of making your strategy visible. So for example, which I mentioned before, through a theory of change. But regardless of how you choose to present your strategy, being really intentional about it is important because, like the joke I just made, there are so many unspoken assumptions about our strategies that make it difficult to be on the same page with one another if it's not incredibly explicit. I'm sure a lot of you have gone through a process where you've tried to talk about strategy with people and have started from the assumption that everyone's on the same page and then realized midway through that everyone's talking about something slightly or very different. That's incredibly common within organizations to have different ways or ideas about in terms of how the organization strategy is articulated. Often the solution for this is to create a written document that unfortunately no one refers to, or to just leave things unsaid and just based on the mental models that we have in our own minds. So making strategies visible by constantly connecting our day-to-day work to them, including different groups of people in strategic conversations, and intentionally and consistently zooming in and out between your strategies and your everyday activities can help make your strategies visible. So for example, if you're talking about a particular program and a decision you're making within a program, talking about that in the context of the larger strategy, which in this case everyone is familiar with, and understanding how it relates can be incredibly helpful. This is important to be able to learn as a group, but also to work in an aligned way towards the same purpose. Because if you're thinking that a task that you're doing, an activity, is for a different strategic aim, or you don't even know what strategic aim it's working towards, it's hard to make strategic decisions because instead you're just making very narrow decisions about the operations of that particular thing. So making strategy visible is incredibly important. It's also incredibly important to grapple with complexity. As I mentioned before, and as we all know, we all exist in a bigger world, and there will be many factors within and outside of our control that affect our ability to achieve the impact we're striving towards. And it can be incredibly time-consuming and often overwhelming to think about all of the factors that influence our organization's strategy. So while it's important to focus and be on the same page about what your mandate and mission is and to create some boundaries around that, it's also important to understand the larger context that you're working on. So it's always this tension and balance between understanding the world around you and its complexity and holding that, and understanding that the power that you want to create or that you have in your context and how you want to move your strategy forward. And there are lots of ways to start to map out and grapple with that complexity. So for example, you might invest in a dedicated activity. So like systems mapping, where you're trying to, you're spending 3 meetings trying to understand the different parts of your system that you're a part of and how that influences the strategic opportunities in your context. And while those dedicated resources are often necessary and really important, it's also important to consider how you're embedding the findings from any individual activity in your strategy and how that translates to your everyday work. So yes, any activity that you do from a strategic lens shouldn't exist in a box. When you're trying to understand complexity, it's not an activity that you do and you move on. The whole point is to grapple with what it looks like in an everyday way. Another way to grapple with complexity is to intentionally take both proactive and reactive approaches within your strategy. So this means taking an approach where you're really balancing how to build a strategy that responds to immediate needs in your context, as well as taking a longer-term preventative approach. So for example, if you're an organization concerned with high school graduation rates and improving them, You might invest in early childhood because you know that there's a link between children's early experiences and their success in school later in life. And you might also be supporting tutoring programs that are helping people in the moment. So one of the ways of thinking about complexity is to balance that immediate response for immediate need, but also to have a longer term prevention strategy. The third practical requirement for strategic learning is that you are constantly iterating your strategy and embedding what you learn into what you're doing. So the learning process is always very active, iterative, and happening in real time. You're always learning through what you're doing when you're engaged in strategic learning, and it's not a separate activity. And there has to be a close connection between strategy, learning, and implementation. And again, I think this is something like we say and don't quite know how to do. And I find this quote helpful in being slightly more specific about what it looks like in an organizational context. It reads, strategic learning integrates evaluation and evaluative thinking into strategic decision-making and brings timely data, so timely is a key word there, to the table for reflection and use. It means making evaluation part of the intervention, embedding it so that it influences the process. This emphasizes that strategic learning is really a way of describing an approach to evaluation or learning that aims at helping organizations learn in real time and adapt their strategies to the changing circumstances around them. So if you're writing, like trying to learn from something that happened, writing a report far after the fact that doesn't connect the findings from that to the organization's current context and current situation, that could be helpful as like an artifact for others to look at or something to reflect on in like, I don't know, in the future, or as like a record celebrating what you achieved. But that wouldn't necessarily help you with strategic learning. Strategic learning really means that you're tying what you are learning to the strategic questions that you have in front of you at that time. So there should be a direct line between what you're learning and what you're doing. The fourth requirement is to acknowledge our organizational, but also our cultural and cognitive biases or mental models that we use to make sense of the world. And this is something that I think like is connected to what Peter mentioned earlier about it's all about creating certain habits and practices around learning and strategic learning. If we aren't willing to think critically, to test our assumptions, we're not going to create those habits. All of our strategies are based on flawed information. It's just it's just the extent to which they are flawed and how actively we're learning about those flaws and correcting for them. And we have big blind spots, which can get in our way of being effective. These biases and assumptions are inevitable and completely natural. So for example, there are common biases that we have as human beings, like confirmation bias, which is our tendency to pay attention to and accept information that confirms what we already believe. And having confirmation bias doesn't make us bad people, but we know it exists. And so it's something that we need to actively work against. We'll also have more specific biases within our organization. For example, you might believe that policy work is the only and most effective way to achieve the change you're working towards, and you've never tested that assumption. If that assumption is wrong, you're in trouble. You'll never achieve the change that you're trying to achieve. You might also inherently value what people in formal leadership positions say compared to people with lived experience or people from community on the ground, or vice versa. Being aware of those assumptions and working against them to have a more full picture of what your context is and what your organization's capacities are really important, because it impacts the types of information that we trust and pay attention to. And it's how we decide what data we think is important. And I'm using data broadly, not only like data on a spreadsheet, but data from our world. All of this is supported by having and actively investing in a culture of learning, which again goes back to the habits and practices. This culture of learning is supported by beliefs, values, practices, habits, and rituals. Culture is created through our interactions with one another and can be intentionally built. I think it's like, sounds like a broad world. It might sound sort of amorphous or out of our control, but culture is actually very solid, and there's things that we do every day to reinforce or to change the culture around us. So building a learning culture requires an active investment on the part of leadership, and it requires deep buy-in for everyone involved. If there isn't a culture of learning within the organization, it will be incredibly hard to do, to fulfill the practical requirements that I already shared, and to do any sort of strategic learning, because you would be putting forward a hypothesis of, this is what we're trying to achieve. Here's our story of how and why we're doing what we're doing to achieve our end goals. And there'd be a lack of a willingness to actually test that and learn about it. And given the complexity of it all, you know, we will be wrong in some aspects of it. And so this culture of learning is so important. And this can look like creating space for reflection and curiosity, a willingness to share challenges and successes transparently at all levels within the organization, giving permission to fail, having a willingness to question assumptions, and setting expectations, very clear expectations around improvement and continuous learning. Because when we have a culture of learning, we're willing to integrate what we've learned into how we do things. So I want to pause for a moment and do a quick poll, because I'm sure many of you have thought about creating a culture of learning in the past and are doing aspects of it very successfully. So Emma is going to launch a poll, and I want you to choose the aspect of your organization's culture of learning that you're the most proud of. And we're forcing you to choose a single thing, even if you're proud of more than one thing. That's great, but the most proud of. Do we have the results?
Yes, so we've got sorry, I was just waiting for one more person we've got about 90% participated, I think. So
that's great.
I will end the poll here, and then I believe I can now share the results with everyone. Sammy, if you can confirm.
Oh, this is so interesting. But the thing that stands out to me the most, that 0% said that they've set expectations around, or that they're most proud of setting expectations around improvement, which is the most like bureaucratic or like I don't know, operationalized option there. So maybe it's the least fulfilling thing to do, so you're not as proud of it. Or maybe it's been really hard to transition to like the broader ideas of creating space for reflection and curiosity, and the more strict is the wrong word, but I'll just use it, strict idea of setting expectations around improvement. That's really interesting. I would love to send you into your small groups for a few minutes to just talk about and share with one another how you created this aspect of this culture of learning within your organizations, and what opportunities it's created and what challenges you've come up against. We hope this is a small opportunity for you to share some of your success and learn from one another. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about the opportunity that strategic learning creates, some questions you can ask yourself to know whether you're on, to think critically about the strategic learning path you're on, and then we will close out. So we'll send you into small groups for maybe 7 minutes.
Okay, give me just 1 second here. Okay, I'll open up the rooms now.
Okay. Welcome back, everyone. Is everyone back, Emma?
Still waiting on some people.
Okay, that's good. They're just like, don't want to leave.
Yeah, they're gonna hold out till the end.
Nice. It makes me feel bad, but it's also good.
Yeah. Okay. Everyone.
Hi,
should be
everyone.
now.
I'm glad, I hope that was a nice small group conversation and that you're feeling energized, thinking about the ways that you're already supporting a culture of learning in your organizations. And most generally, as we're like winding down a little, I hope you're excited about the opportunity for strategic learning. While the approach does take investment in terms of intentionality and time, I think it's becoming especially obvious that taking a strategic learning approach presents incredible opportunity. I'm sure it always has, but I'm sure many of you can relate when I say that the past year and a half has just overemphasized perhaps the flux and uncertainty in our world. And I know I feel empowered by knowing that there's an approach and tools that can actually help us account for the complex context we all live in and the emerging opportunities and challenges that will always arise. Ultimately, strategic learning is about making your organization more aligned, resilient, and adaptable. So they are all good things. The final thing I wanted to share with you all are just some questions you can ask yourselves as you start or continue on this path of taking a strategic learning approach. I think it can be hard to know if the learning you're doing is effective. Of course, you're going to have very specific ways that you can track your own learning within your organization. But in all strategic learning contexts, I think the following questions can be really helpful to ask yourself and your teams. So you might want to ask yourself, is the information generated from the learning we're doing being used? Has the learning supported conversation around emerging strategic opportunities and challenges? Has your theory of change changed as a result of what was learned? And are your strategies strengthening over time? Ideally, these questions aren't answered with a simple yes or no. I encourage you to always ask how and why. As you ask these questions with your team or with other important stakeholders, they can prompt really rich conversations that get at the challenges that you're facing with doing meaningful strategic learning, and also the success that you've had, which is always worth celebrating. So as a reminder of everything we've covered today, strategic learning is defined as systematically acquiring and applying knowledge to inform adaptation and change. And in the organizational context, that learning is about your organization's strategy. Second, engaging in strategic learning requires certain practices, mindsets, and cultures, and those can and actually need to be actively supported. Third, strategic learning creates the opportunity to account for context and emergence. The need for this is especially apparent in our world, which feels like and actually is constantly in flux and changing so quickly. Strategic learning ultimately makes you more aligned, resilient, and adaptable as an organization. And last, integrating strategic learning is an essential process, I will say, instead of step, which you can monitor. There are questions you can ask yourselves to know whether, how, and why you've been successful at implementing a strategic learning approach in your organization. I do hope this high-level overview of the concept of strategic learning was helpful and energizing for you. I realized we kept things really high-level and theoretical. The good news is that there are tools out there that can support you on this path. That said, in the end, I really think it's about carving out time to ask some of these questions with you and your team and to build on whatever your starting point is. I think at first these questions feel really high level, but then when you actually get into it with your team, you could talk about it in a really grounded way. And I'm going to pass it off to Peter and Emma now, who are going to share a little bit about what opportunities there are to explore some of the things that I brought up today in more depth with additional tools and support. And hopefully you're excited to keep going.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Sami,
Thank
I think there's one more slide in here that sort of gives a bit of a, there we go, perfect. So
Yes.
Emma, is it okay if I just jump in and just build on quickly on what Sami said, and then you can explain how we get involved in this stuff?
Absolutely.
So I think what Sami laid out there is, yes, today's thing was quite high level in a theoretical and building the case for strategic learning and kind of making us think about how we would practically apply a strategic learning approach. Now, what we're hoping to do in January, and the plan is to run a series of facilitated experiences where we'll have nonprofits in the room together, working through a set of sort of practical steps in that journey. And so part of it, you'll notice, is we're going to have recorded lectures and facilitated sessions, one of which is going to look at how do we actually map our internal world and our external world. So how do we understand that context, the bird's eye view and the worm's eye view? We're going to talk about strategy and how do we think about strategy as a theory of change, and how do we understand how change happens, and give you some very practical tools to do that thinking work. We're then going to walk you through a process where you'll have a chance to really identify strategic learning priorities that are relevant to your organization. And then the last part of all of that is to give you some practical tools and approaches for actually figuring out how you're going to gather evidence and how do you bring that rigor into your learning process. So those steps ahead include pre-recorded lectures that'll be accessible to you, pre-recorded lectures, as well as an applied hands-on facilitated component. So we hope that you're excited about that possibility of joining us for that learning process. Emma, do you want to walk us through what that actually looks like getting involved?
Yeah, for sure. So at the end of today, I guess, I'm thinking it'll be today. It might end up being a little bit later in this week. We're going to send out a link, a follow-up email, which has the link to this recording. And then we'll also send out a link to register for this course. And so as Peter said, it'll start up in January. It's 6 sessions. It'll go through January through March. And there's also a opportunity for kind of a little bit of one-on-one coaching / mentorship. And it's a blended learning model. So as Peter mentioned, there's pre-recorded lectures that you'll have to review in advance of what we're calling our live sessions. This will still be over Zoom. We're just not sure what the world's going to look like early next year, but you'll have an opportunity for, kind of the quote-unquote live, or I don't want to say in person, we're not in person, but facilitated discussion as well as some on your own learning. It's 21 instructional hours, which means it is eligible for the Canada-Alberta Jobs Grant, which will cover 2/3 of the course, of the cost of the course. And that is pretty much all of it. My contact info is on the slide right now. It's emma@ecvo.ca. You're welcome to send me an email with any questions. And like I said, we're also going to send out a follow-up email after this session, which will include a link to register if you are so interested. And it's something that we encourage organizations who are keen to kind of start really diving into these concepts and these processes and practices. as it'll be a really great opportunity to work through some of your questions and concerns with other organizations, as well as get some practical kind of tips and activities and whatnot to do more. So with all that, I want to say a huge thank you to Sami for chatting with us today, sharing the high-level overview. I think it's a really great place to start for all of us before we dive into some of these deeper concepts. So thank you, Sami, for the awesome and interactive presentation. And then I also want to say thank you to everyone here for being so engaged, willing to kind of share your thoughts and insights, and for joining us today. Oh, and I'm just going to pop my email. Someone asked. I'll just pop my email in the chat if anyone wants to connect with me. It's emma@ecvo.ca. So again, a huge thank you. And I hope everyone has a great rest of